So,
if anybody can't, just put something in the Q&A, please.
Yes, so hopefully everybody can see my presentation. And if you have any questions for me over the course of this presentation, I do invite you to type them into the Q&A box. And then if they come to my attention while I'm speaking, I'm happy to answer in the moment. Otherwise, happy to address those questions at the end of my presentation. So good evening, and thank you for having me today. My name is Michelle, and I work with the Toronto Zoo. I work with something called the Great Lakes Program. So the Great Lakes Program has been around for about 20 years now. We operate within the Toronto Zoo, but we are provincially and federally funded. We are an education and outreach program, and we deliver free programming to Ontario schools. We offer this wonderful free service to teachers to teach grades K through 12 about the Great Lakes and about some of the aquatic species at risk in this region. So this year, naturally with the pandemic, with COVID, we've had to sort of pivot, and our programming is almost entirely virtual this year. But it's been, it's had its positives and negatives because we have been able to extend our reach, as far east as the Ottawa region, and I've even been able to give a few presentations to schools up in the north of the province, which otherwise would be outside of our reach. So it's at least expanded the schools that we're able to visit, at least virtually. So as Chris mentioned, a bit about me, my background. I am a registered veterinary technician, and I've worked in the past few years as an aquarist, so specifically in the husbandry of fishes, in the husbandry and veterinary treatment of fishes, which is what brings me to this position at the zoo. Prior to that, I have years of experience as a science educator, including for the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa, for Ripley's Aquarium, and now at the zoo. So my passion is really science, nature, and sort of bringing those topics and sharing my passions with the public. So again, I'm very happy to be here this evening. Thank you so much for having me. Your group has already made a land acknowledgement, so I would also just like to briefly mention the land on which the zoo itself is located, so also falls under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We would like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, Hiawatha First Nation, Alderville First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. So as an organization, we acknowledge that we are located on ancestral and treaty lands. We acknowledge the land's history, and we are certainly grateful for the land that allows us to do our work of saving species, teaching and learning every day. So let us acknowledge the land on which we are today that allows us to live and to learn. I suppose I should mention what I'm here to talk about. I am here today to talk about the Great Lakes region, and to talk to you, to introduce to you some of the incredible aquatic species at risk in this region, which is sort of the primary area of focus of the Great Lakes program. Is we're involved in the education about these species, and also in a fair bit of conservation work as well, especially as it pertains to freshwater mussels. But I'll get into that in just a few moments. So here, of course, we have our beautiful Great Lakes region as seen from above, as seen from satellite imaging. And I've added Hamilton, more or less, to the map. So, of course, our local Great Lake, we have this in common, is Lake Ontario. Now, Lake Superior to the north is not only the largest Great Lake, but by a fair margin, Lake Superior contains 50% of all the fresh water in the entire Great Lakes system. So not only is it the largest in terms of area, but the deepest as well. So it alone contains 50% of all the fresh water in this region. Lake Michigan is the most populated of the Great Lakes. It falls entirely on the American side of the border, and there's a high concentration of American cities built up around Lake Michigan. Chicago comes to mind. So it is the most populated Great Lake in terms of human population. Lake Huron in the center has the longest shoreline, owed in part to its bays, islands, and inlets. Lake Erie to the south is the smallest of the Great Lakes, and unfortunately, one of the most polluted. And then Lake Ontario, of course, our local Great Lake, and likely the lake that we have perhaps the most personal experience with. So this Great Lakes region, it's a hugely important ecosystem and home to about 3,500 different species of plant and animal. So, you know, even within this region, we're seeing very different habitats. You know, the crystal clear waters of Georgian Bay, ponds and wetlands. Some of the beaches of the Great Lakes seem downright oceanic in terms of their scope and their currents, their waves. So an incredible diversity of habitats, of biomes. And like I said, the Great Lakes region supports those 3,500 different species of plant and animal life. So it is an incredibly biodiverse region. And nothing, you know, nothing shows that better than this slide, just a sampling of some of the different kinds of life to be found in this region. I think when it comes to aquatic habitats, a lot of people, their minds go to fish, and as an aquarist, that's where my mind tends to go as well. But it is, of course, home to numerous reptile species, turtles, snakes, amphibians like frogs and toads. As you know, a great diversity of bird species, mammals, whether they're aquatic like beavers or river otters, or other species of terrestrial mammals that live in the region and rely on the lakes as their source of water. And I think something that we don't necessarily think of at first glance are smaller organisms like crayfishes, crustaceans that are related to ocean crabs and lobsters, thousands of species of insect, freshwater mussels. There are 41 different species of freshwater mussel that are native to Ontario. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on, but they are actually vital to the overall health of the lakes themselves. And they are a big part of the work that we do at the, you know, that the Great Lakes team does at the Toronto Zoo. But I do most of the time bring it back to fish. That is my area of expertise. And in the Great Lakes region, there are 150 different kinds of fish that are native to this region. And that's not including invasive species, which I'll touch on as well. So these, of course, are freshwater fishes. You do have some migrating species that you see here, like the salmon. They are able to survive in the ocean. But for the most part, the freshwater fishes of the Great Lakes survive and thrive exclusively in freshwater. So I'm just pausing here to take a look. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to forge ahead. But this, to me, is biodiversity in action, right? These 150 different species, every shape, every size, every color, every form and function of freshwater fish, and each has a distinct role to play in this ecosystem. So this to me is biodiversity in action. So I would like to introduce you to some of these fishes, to some of these species. Oh, and that's actually showing the 41 varieties of freshwater mussels in Ontario alone. And I'll introduce you a bit more intimately to some of these species. I know that it's hard to get excited about mussels in the way that I get excited about mussels. They don't have a lot of personality, but they are vitally important to the health of the lakes themselves. So I'll introduce you to some of these species. Now, before I do that, before I continue, I did sort of want to mention the human connection to the Great Lakes. Of course, so many of us rely on the Great Lakes as the source of our drinking water. That is certainly true in Toronto and Hamilton. But maybe you didn't know that 1/3 of all Canadians draws their drinking water from one of the Great Lakes alone. And considering that they fall in our province, Ontario, that says something about the distribution of our population, but it's still astounding to me that 10 million Canadians rely on one of the Great Lakes for the water that they drink and otherwise use daily. So that human connection to the Great Lakes is also very important. I just wanted to touch on that because I always jump straight into the animals, but as a resource of drinking water, vitally important to 10 million Canadians and even more Americans on that side of the border. So today I'd like to introduce you to some of the incredible species, the aquatic species at risk in this Great Lakes region. So these are classified as vulnerable species under the Species at Risk Act here in Canada. So the first of these species is the lake sturgeon, which is the single largest fish in the Great Lakes. It can reach a size of 2 meters or 6 feet. So in terms of social distancing, just stay 1 sturgeon apart and you're good to go. This fish can weigh 300 pounds, so absolutely massive. It is also a prehistoric fish. The family sturgeon dates back to the time of the dinosaurs. We have evidence of the sturgeon family from 150 million years ago. So this is very much a living fossil species, a prehistoric fish, virtually unchanged for millions of years. Now, as such, just like sharks, they have a cartilaginous skeleton. So we, of course, have cartilage in our noses and ears, that flexible material. Cartilage evolved before bone. So that speaks to just how ancient this species is. So they have that in common with sharks, those cartilaginous skeletons. Sharks are also, prehistoric, dating from about the same time period, 150 million years ago. Now, the reason the lake sturgeon is endangered in the Great Lakes is because for many years they were overfished. As you can see, they were prized by anglers, and for many years they were harvested for their eggs, which we know as caviar. And it was kind of this twofold invasion on the sturgeon population. The adults were being fished out of the water, eggs were being harvested before they could hatch. The species did not have the opportunity to reproduce, not quickly enough. And this species does not reproduce until it is in its 30s. They have a lifespan of 70 to 100 years. So comparable to humans. So they were being fished out of the water before they had the chance to reproduce. When females did have eggs, they were often harvested and not given the chance to hatch. So you can see without that chance for regular reproduction, we saw a sharp decline in lake sturgeon populations. So they are now endangered. That's good news in that they are now classified as endangered and are now protected. So it is illegal to fish for sturgeon and to harvest their eggs. So at the very least, that status has given them certain protections. And zoos and aquariums are quite involved in reintroducing this species. So these are called Head Start programs, where the sturgeon eggs are hatched in captivity at zoos and aquariums. The juvenile sturgeon are given the chance to grow, maybe a year or two old, before they are released back into the environment, back into lakes and rivers. It's a Head Start program because by reaching a certain size before they're released, there's a better chance of them surviving to adulthood. Sturgeon, you know, as big as they get, are still quite small as fry. So that gives them a head start and a better opportunity to survive to a, you know, to maturity and to reproductive age. So there's a number of zoos and aquariums in North America that are involved in that rehabilitation of this species. If we're talking biodiversity, that's the largest fish of the Great Lakes, and now we'll turn to one of the smallest. This is the Redside dace, and I actually have a 3D printed model that I'll hold right up to the camera. This is a minnow, just 10 to 12 centimeters long, just about the size of my finger. Now this species, 80% of Redside dace in Canada live in the GTA. It's an urban species. They live in streams that drain into Lake Ontario. So in fact, on the zoo's property, Rouge National Park that surrounds the zoo, there are 2 rivers there that are home to populations of Redside dace. Very much an urban fish, which is also why it is endangered. A lot of these streams where it lives have become badly polluted. Now, the Redside dace has a really interesting feeding behavior. It leaps out of the water like a flying fish to catch mosquitoes and flies right out of the air. So it's a really incredible hunting behavior. And this little fish is carnivorous. But if the water becomes at all turbid, cloudy, polluted, the Redside dace has a difficult time visualizing its prey and is not able to feed. So it's habitat loss, the pollution of these urban streams, that is leading to a decline in Redside dace populations. And it's problematic for us because they eat mosquitoes, this nuisance species. As we see a decline in Redside dace populations, inversely, we're going to see a rise in mosquito populations. So certainly to our benefit to protect this species. It is, again, protected now by the government. Not only it, but the streams where it lives become automatically protected. And it says here can indicate the overall health of an ecosystem. Because the Redside dace is so, it has such a tight window of water quality parameters in which it can survive. Very tight parameters in terms of temperature and water turbidity. So if Redside dace are in a stream, it is an indicator of the overall health of that stream. Overall indication that the water quality of that stream is likely high. So they're an indicator species and important for that reason. You can see here they were also used as bait, live bait, but contributed to their decline. That, of course, is now illegal. Next up is one of my favorites again. The American eel is a really incredible fish. Oh, I see a question. Are these animals protected federally and provincially? So I will say that the lake sturgeon, it is protected, it is endangered in Ontario. It is the Great Lakes population of lake sturgeon specifically that are classified as endangered. So that is a provincial designation. On the federal level, I believe that the lake sturgeon is classified as threatened. And it's the same with the American eel. They are classified as endangered provincially. I believe that their federal designation is threatened or perhaps even special concern. We use the designations for the Great Lakes populations specifically. Sometimes there are other, for example, with lake sturgeon, there are populations of lake sturgeon to the west of Canada that are doing a little bit better. Therefore, they're classified as special concern and threatened. So yes, to answer your question, it kind of depends on the species, but we tend to focus on the designation for the Great Lakes population of the animal. And in the case of both the American eel and the sturgeon, the Great Lakes populations they're more vulnerable than other similar populations in other parts of the country. I hope that answers your question. And if not, feel free to, go ahead. It looks like somebody's potentially answering. Oh, no, it's gone. Okay, great. I hope that answered the question. So the American eel, a really incredible fish, used to be very numerous in Lake Ontario. They accounted for 50% of all the biomass in all of Lake Ontario. So very plentiful, and they were a very important part of Indigenous diets because they are quite nutritious. So this fish starts its life, as you can see in the center photo, totally translucent. It starts its life in the open ocean in the Sargasso Sea off the coast of Florida. We don't know a lot about their lives in the ocean. They're quite mysterious, but when they're born, they're completely translucent. That's really, at that size, the only defense against a predator. When you're that size in the open ocean, to be invisible is your best bet. So they are born in the Sargasso Sea. They grow just a little bit, and then they start the long migration north to the Great Lakes. Then they feed in the Great Lakes for many years. They reach maturity and then return to the Sargasso Sea to lay their eggs, to spawn. So it is like the reverse migration to a salmon. It's saltwater to freshwater and back to saltwater. But all in, that's a migration of about 5,000 kilometers. Really incredible. And they have some unique adaptations to help them in that endeavor. You can see in the bottom right photo that the American eel is able to come up out of the water. If there's some kind of barrier in the water, they can exit the water, cover their bodies in mucus, and for a short time, they breathe transdermally through their skin. So they breathe air for a short period. So a really incredible adaptation that allows them to bypass aquatic barriers in their migration. Unfortunately, endangered now because of barriers to migration. For example, hydroelectric dams, which they are simply not able to get around. That has contributed to their decline. The Atlantic salmon is an interesting case, is considered extirpated or locally extinct in Lake Ontario. So this is one of the animals where there are other populations in the Atlantic Ocean and in other lakes and rivers in Canada, but the Great Lakes population of Atlantic salmon is considered extinct. It was overfished in the 1800s to the point of extinction. Now, that was a unique population because instead of migrating from freshwater streams into the ocean and returning upstream to spawn, the Lake Ontario population of Atlantic salmon, they basically were born in streams and rivers connecting to Lake Ontario. they migrated to the open waters of Lake Ontario and then returned upstream to where they themselves had been born to lay their own eggs. So they were self-contained in the Lake Ontario watershed. But that population unfortunately overfished in the 1800s and is now considered extinct. So that's what's meant by the word anadromous, which is freshwater to saltwater to freshwater migration. But that Lake Ontario population lived its entire life in freshwater. But the zoo is part of a great, really exciting program. It's called Aqualinks. And basically in this program, we give Atlantic salmon eggs. Now, obviously they're not true Lake Ontario salmon eggs because that population was entirely decimated in the 1800s, but the species continues to survive in other parts of the country. But we give Atlantic salmon eggs to local schools in the Toronto area. We teach the classrooms how to raise their fry, their alevins, their baby salmon. And then after about 6 months, we have a mass release with hundreds of students into the waterways connecting to Lake Ontario. So we're just one of many organizations involved in this initiative to bring Atlantic salmon back to Lake Ontario. It's a pretty remarkable thing. This release takes place every spring. COVID has unfortunately thrown a wrench in this program. Actually, last year when the schools first shut down, we had to rescue all the baby salmons from these schools that had closed due to the virus. So there is a pin on that aspect of the program this year, but we do currently have at the zoo about 200 Atlantic salmon eggs that have just hatched. And then we do plan on head starting those salmon and eventually releasing them along with our partner organizations back into Lake Ontario waterways. The hope is that by 2025, we would have a viable population of Atlantic salmon successfully reintroduced to Lake Ontario. So really exciting program. We're very much hoping it comes back full force next year. The spotted gar is another endangered fish of the Great Lakes. Quite a stealthy fish. It hides in seagrasses and seaweeds, and it's a nocturnal animal, and it is an ambush predator. So it actually can surprise its prey. As you can see, they have these elongated rostrums with rows on rows of sharp teeth that are almost alligator-like. And you can see in that action shot, that they're able to consume prey a fair bit larger than you might think. So they have these elongated rostrums and those many sharp teeth. One species of gar, in fact, is called the alligator gar, I believe for that reason. So this species is considered endangered in the Great Lakes system as well. Coming to shellfish, the question of freshwater mussels, I understand that it's hard to get excited about mollusks. They don't have a lot of personality, they don't have faces, but freshwater mussels are vitally important to the Great Lakes. There are 41 species of freshwater mussel in in the province of Ontario alone. And their function is essentially as cleaners and decontaminators. So mussels eat through filtration. Actually, you can see in the picture on the left, you can see the mussel has opened its shell and the line of the mouth. They filter, feed plankton, algae, and bacteria out of the water. And that act of filter feeding also actively decontaminates the water. So a single northern riffle shell, which is this species of freshwater mussel, is able to filter, feed, and decontaminate 9 liters of water per hour. So I'm sure that you've encountered in the summers along Lake Ontario, high E. coli counts where beaches are closed. A healthy freshwater mussel population in Lake Ontario can help control contaminants, bacterial contaminants like E. coli. So they are so important, so vital to the overall water quality of the Great Lakes. The reason so many of these freshwater mussels are endangered, as you can probably imagine, is invasive species like the zebra mussel. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. But a big part of what we do at the Great Lakes team, the Great Lakes program, is we're involved in freshwater mussel counts and surveys and field work. I'll show you I think I have a slide dedicated to it later in the presentation, but we actually have an app called the Clam Counter app, whereby if you're out in your local natural spaces and you encounter a mussel, any mussel, the app will help you identify the mussel. And if it is a species of indigenous freshwater mussel, you can report that information directly to us because we're involved in surveys in this area. So I would like to speak briefly to some of the threats that the Great Lakes are facing. Most of these threats, all of these threats, I would say, come back to the fact that the Great Lakes region is heavily populated. And it is our human activities, our urban activities that are the #1 cause for concern in this region. So I hinted at it, the problem of invasive species is very real in the Great Lakes. Invasive species meaning any species of plant or animal that comes from elsewhere is accidentally introduced into an environment where it does not belong and then takes over and begins to pose a risk to either local wildlife or even human populations. So the Great Lakes has a number of active invasive species. Maybe you've heard of the sea lamprey, the vampire fish. 50 years ago, well, actually, not 50 years ago anymore, even earlier, the sea lamprey, which is native to the Atlantic Ocean, swam through our canal systems from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes system. They are a highly adaptable fish. They reproduce very quickly. So once they arrived in the Great Lakes, they quickly became established and then quickly after that became invasive, which is a problem because they are a predatory fish. You can see they have sucking lips and sharp cutting teeth. They are able to attach to a fish and drain it of its bodily fluids, the vampire fish. So the sea lamprey, through our man-made canal system, wound up in the Great Lakes, reproduces very quickly. It had no natural predators in this ecosystem. Local fishes had no defense against this kind of predator. It spread very quickly. And when it was first introduced, we saw a sharp decline in local fish populations. Kind of a success story though, because it led to the formation of the Great Lakes Commission. There have been a number of successful interventions to try to control populations of lamprey in the Great Lakes, including the construction of dams that are meant to herd and trap sea lampreys during their annual migrations so that they can be easily scooped out of the water. And there have been a number of chemicals that have been proven to target lamprey larvae without harming other local fishes. So there has been a successful attack fronted against the sea lamprey population. It has declined significantly. It is a bit of a success story, but the sea lamprey will likely now always live in the Great Lakes. Once an invasive species is established, the best we can hope for is to reduce its effects. Very hard to get rid of that species altogether. A few other familiar faces here. The zebra mussel problem is, of course, very acute. These small mussels were introduced by ships from Europe, very small, reproduce very quickly. Again, once they were introduced, they took over. They spread quickly to all 5 of the Great Lakes. They are a bit insidious because they can be hard to spot in larval form. They can be easily transported by boats or fishing equipment from body of water to body of water. That's why it's so important to rinse all of your boating and fishing equipment after use and to let it dry in the sun where possible. So we can see here that zebra mussels can cause huge economic losses in terms of damaging boat equipment, and they have led to a decline in local mussel populations. We see then also a decline in water quality. Or the inverse, if there are too many zebra mussels in a particular area, they can actually filter out so much of the plankton in the water as to make the water too clear so that sun is able to reach a greater depth, which can cause dangerous algal blooms. So either we see a decline in water quality where zebra mussels are present, or there's almost this overfiltration of plankton so that local species aren't able to feed. And then you have that kind of reverse problem where the water becomes too clear, the sun is able to penetrate too deep and cause algal blooms where they would not otherwise occur. All around, zebra mussels are a problem. And then a few other species at the bottom here, the round goby you might be familiar with, introduced from Europe in the ballasts of ships. And then the Asian carp is actually 4 different species of carps: black carps, silver carps, grass carps, and big-headed carps. So these are 4 species of carps that were native to Asia. They were brought over to North America by fish farmers in the United States because they kept their fish ponds nice and clean of algae, but weather patterns and rain caused flooding, and Asian carps were accidentally introduced into American waterways. And since that time, they've been gradually making their way north up the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. Right now, they are on the cusp of Lake Michigan. And if they enter the Great Lakes, they sort of promise to be the next invasion. They reproduce very quickly. They eat indiscriminately. You can see in this photo, the middle photo there, those are silver carps. If they are startled by any kind of sound like a boat motor, they will all leap out of the water en masse. It's been known to cause physical injury. So Asian carps are on the cusp of the Great Lakes, and Canadian and American governments are having to work together jointly to monitor their movement. We're trying to keep them out of the Great Lakes system using strategies like bubble barriers and even sound barriers, because if they enter the Great Lakes system, it has the potential to be catastrophic from a biological and economic standpoint. So we have here kind of a success story, some current problems, and a species that we are keeping a very close eye on and that we hope does not enter this system. So here, just looking a little bit closer at the mouth parts of the sea lamprey, zebra mussels, and Asian carps. All right, I've talked a lot, but I have just one final kind of section that I want to speak to, and it's the question of what we can do to help. So I am a big believer in the power of small everyday actions, small changes that we make to our day-to-day habits. When you add up that action, you multiply that daily action by 365 days in the year, you multiply your small actions by everybody in this club, multiplied by every other person that I spoke to today, and our small actions start to add up and create, big positive movements and positive change for this region. So it starts with the simple conservation of water, with the understanding that so many Canadians rely on the Great Lakes as the source of their fresh water. Very simple actions can make a big difference. Taking shorter showers where possible, using appliances like dishwashers and washing machines only when they're full, so we're using them less often. A big change that I made, it's actually a small change, but I think it adds up over time, is for me, I was very guilty of letting the water run until it was the temperature I wanted, until it was absolutely freezing cold to fill my water bottle. So the simple action of leaving my water bottle in the fridge overnight, prevents me from letting the tap run for that minute or two before it gets to the exact right temperature. So it's about being aware of our water usage and taking small steps to reduce our usage, to use only as much as we need. Obviously, the biggest change there is going to come from adopting Energy Star appliances that use less electricity and less water with every use. This might be geared more toward my student audiences, but the concept of not littering, disposing of our trash appropriately. I think something that's perhaps more relevant is the idea that anything that goes down our drains ultimately returns to Lake Ontario in this region. So being careful about the kinds of cleaning products that we use, the kinds of toiletries that we use, conscious of the fact that drain water does ultimately end up back in the lake. So in 2018, Canada passed a ban on something called microbeads, which were actually little microplastics used in things like toothbrushes and facial scrubs for microdermabrasion. But using those toothpastes and those cleansing products released those microplastics into the environment. So microbead products have been banned in Canada since 2018, but the ban is on the production of new product. Stores are still allowed to sell what they already have in their inventory. So you might still see microbead products on the shelves, and stores are allowed to do that until they run through their stock, but the production of products using microbeads or advertising microbeads was banned in 2018. So just one of the ways to think about what goes down our drains and how it ultimately impacts the lakes. Reduce, reuse, recycle are fairly obvious. I think that the most power comes from rethinking the products that we use every day, asking ourselves, can this disposable item be made reusable? If it has to be disposable, can it be made of something better for the environment than plastic? Plastic takes, as you know, decades or hundreds of years to break down once it enters the environment. So the plastics problem in the Great Lakes is the same as it is in our oceans. These plastic items end up in the lakes. They take decades or hundreds of years to fully break down. Meanwhile, they're breaking into smaller and smaller pieces, which are consumed by wildlife. It's a huge problem. So I would invite, rather than, reduce, reuse, recycle is an oversimplification. I think where we have the most power is in rethinking the items that we use every day and asking ourselves, can it be reusable, or can it at least be made of something other than plastic? Can it be made out of paper, cardboard, or even bamboo? Which comes down to being an informed consumer. So the zoo is now in partnership with OceanWise. I'm not here to tell you that seafood is bad. There is a way to eat seafood to support the seafood industry that is better for the ocean and our freshwater ecosystems. So if seafood is stamped with the OceanWise symbol, which you see here, this program is run out of the Vancouver Aquarium. It indicates that that species of fish is not vulnerable. that species of fish has a healthy population. It indicates that that company has met quotas and not taken in excess. And it indicates that the manner in which that fish was fished is a more sustainable method with less bycatch, for example, the accidental catch of other species. So if seafood is stamped with the OceanWise symbol, it is a better choice, a more sustainable choice. So I think that there is a way to eat seafood, but there is a way to do it responsibly, sustainably, and more ethically. So OceanWise is a wonderful program if you want to look more into that. We just entered into partnership with them at the zoo. So now even our polar bears are eating OceanWise seafood. And then what the other graphic shows is the idea of fast fashion, you know, these disposable clothing items, every time we wash them, are actually releasing microplastics again down our drains. So it's the idea of being a conscious consumer, purchasing better made clothing that's going to last much longer, rather than these items that are cheaply produced. They break down with every wash, and they're ultimately costing you more money because they're going to wear and tear that much quicker than something that costs more at the head, but is much longer lasting. The Clam Counter, if you are, out hiking near bodies of water in this region, I'd invite you to download the Clam Counter app. It's on Google Play for Android or the App Store for iPhone. And if you see a mussel in a body of water in Ontario, you can use the app. It's very cute and very user-friendly to identify the species of mussel. If it's invasive, you can report that through the invasive species hotline. And if it is a local freshwater species, you can report that sighting to the Great Lakes Program for our surveys of mussels. It's a great example of citizen science and kind of this collective knowledge that helps us have a broader reach. These are some of our wonderful partners. Kat, actually, who was going to give this presentation, has moved on to Ontario Streams. We've worked very closely with them. And I do welcome you to follow us on social media. If you're interested in our, we have a fun fish fact every Friday. We do have a number of events during regular years, such as beach cleanups. You're going to hear about it first through our social media channels. So I do invite you to give us a follow if you want to stay in touch with the Great Lakes Program. That's pretty much everything I have to say. I get very excited, so I do apologize if I've talked for a bit longer than I meant to. But at this point, I was wondering if there were any questions, and I would love to try to answer them. And at this point, if you don't want to type in the Q&A box, I think it would probably be okay to unmute yourself and ask a question in person. Or perhaps I have spoken myself into obsolescence. I've just said everything.
Thanks, Michelle. Now, if anybody does want to ask a question, just click the raise your hand button. It's on the toolbar at the bottom, and I can unmute you.
Oh, I see. Lake Erie has the most productive commercial fishery of the Great Lakes. I believe that yes. And the Great Lakes fishery does supply, I think that the number is in the billions to the province. For that, I'm not sure if it's directly correlated. But Lake Erie, I think, is considered the most polluted of the Great Lakes. I don't know if that has to do with its relatively small size, or if it is because of those commercial industries. But Lake Erie is considered the most polluted of the 5. Three-spined sticklebacks in Lake Ontario. I will admit that I am not familiar with that species, so I don't believe that I can speak to that. That's something that I'd have to look into. Does the zoo have any connection to the Center for Inland Waters? That, again, I'm not sure of. The Great Lakes program does not have a direct connection or partnership. I can't speak for the larger zoo. Is there something you can do if you have zebra mussels? So the number one thing that you can do is, if you are traveling between bodies of water, is to make sure that anything that was in one body of water and is being transported to another distinct body of water, that you rinse off all of that equipment and ideally leave it in the sun to dry for up to 5 days. So there's not much that you can do to combat zebra mussels in your body of water by your cottage, but you can certainly take those actions to help prevent further spread. So it's about rinsing equipment and leaving it to dry in the sun for up to 5 days. But otherwise, we've looked into things like copper for the treatment of zebra mussels, because it is effective against the mussels and their larvae, but it also negatively impacts local fish. So that's not a viable solution. What are the fish industries on Lake Erie? Very good question. I am not sure off the top of my head. I'm trying to think. I just read a statistic about this. Oh my goodness. No, I'm sorry, I can't remember it. I just had a stat that I posted to social media a few weeks ago about a fish in particular that is of like particular commercial value in Lake Erie, and I can't remember the name of that fish. I'm very sorry. So I would have to do some more. I would have to look into it. I would always rather say that I don't know than provide an incorrect answer. Live only in Lake Ontario and not the other Great Lakes. That is another good question. I do believe that they are found in the broader Great Lakes. I do believe that they are found in the broader Great Lakes. That is something, again, I'm so sorry, I don't know off the top of my head, but I do believe that they are considered a Great Lakes species and that they are in some of the other lakes. All of your questions are stumping me. I apologize. It's the kind of thing where I would want to do just a little bit more research before I gave you a definitive answer.
Well, looks like that's it. I think you covered everything. Not that many questions. That's fabulous. Well, thank you so much. That was very informative. Thank you for coming, and maybe we'll have you again for another talk some other time. But right now, that was just wonderful. Appreciate that. Appreciate it coming out.